All right. It's wet and cold. Yesterday it was sunny and warm and fantastic, and now we're back to cold and miserable. But given a day, it'll change and it'll be back to warm, which is one of the reasons that everybody gets sick this time of year. It goes from freezing to hot, freezing to hot. So all 4 seasons in 1 week. So we stopped in our discussion on marketing ethics.
So why should we study?
On the idea that ethics seem to be less relevant in the modern world than perhaps other things that we might need in the world of business. So for example, I teach sales. This is just sort of a recap. And if companies are going to be successful, they have to sell something or they're going to go broke. And in fact, the vast majority of companies that start up do go broke for a variety of reasons. In 5 years, something like over 70% of companies that start up fail because they don't have a product that people want, or there isn't sufficient differentiation, or maybe there is a demand, but they can't bring that product to market at the price that consumers are willing to pay. And there's like lots of reasons. And so when we think about business ethics, and we think about the fact that it's so competitive in the environment now, why should we study ethics? Because you really need hard skills. Or if you don't need hard skills, you need those soft skills that are going to be directly relevant to a return on an employer's investment. And then finally, one of the other reasons that it seems to be difficult to study ethics is that philosophical ethics appears to be subjective. What does it mean to be subjective? Well, it appears to be a matter of opinion. If I give you really hard questions, if we have really easy questions, we can all sort of say, well, you shouldn't do that. But if we give you hard questions, like, should we market marijuana? Now, I would be willing to bet that your generation thinks that this is a less difficult question. But my generation, this was a very difficult question. Why is marijuana only now becoming legalized? And it's still technically illegal because the federal government still considers marijuana to be a controlled, dangerous substance. Why is that? Should we market it? Should we sell it? Should we have recreational pot? In Oklahoma, we have an enormously liberal medical marijuana law. We have the most of the states that have medical marijuana. Oklahoma, which is a conservative Republican state, has the most liberal medical marijuana law. In other states that have medical marijuana, it's limited to a specific number of things in many instances that you can get the card for. So for example, you have to have cancer. You have to be terminal. That's how it started out. What can you get it for in Oklahoma? What's the easiest way to get a card in Oklahoma? Depression. Yeah, or anxiety, social anxiety, or just tell them you can't sleep. Go in, to the doctor. That they have these clinics. Go in and tell them you can't sleep, and wow, there you go.
Do they have like the doctors at the shops in other states?
No, I don't think they do.
Like they do,
but they do in Oklahoma, right? Some of the shops have their own doctors. So if we have these hard questions, like what are the arguments against the legalization of medical marijuana? You all can't think of any because you grew up up in a generation that thinks that these laws are stupid, right? Well, when I was a kid growing up, one of the arguments was it's a gateway drug. What does that mean? It's a gateway drug. Yeah, it's gonna, if you start with this, pretty soon, it's a slippery slope. This is what we call, and we're gonna talk about logic and critical thinking today. The slippery slope argument. This is also called the Pandoras Box argument. And what do we mean by a slippery slope or Pandora's box? So there's a legend, I think it's in Greek mythology. All of the evil in the world is contained in one box. And this is, I think it's Greek. I may have this wrong, but every religion has a story about how evil gets into the world. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, evil gets into the world through original sin. And I think in the Greek mythology, so all of the evil in the world is contained in this box. Pandora's in charge of the box. And if you just open the box and look in, all of the evil can escape. So this is the argument with regard to drugs. It's a slippery slope. It's a Pandora's box. You open the box. You start by opening the box to the legalization of marijuana. And before you know it, you've got what? Well, you've got the legalization of cocaine or meth. And you've got a whole lot of people that are now addicted to really dangerous substances out there. So this seems to be really subjective. Is ethics objective? Well, I would argue that it is. I would say, first of all, it's extremely relevant to our modern world because we make ethical decisions every day in business, whether we think about them or not. And those decisions have consequences for consumers and society at large. And if you aren't ethical, people probably won't do business with you. Benjamin Franklin used to publish something called the Farmer's Almanac, and there were all kinds of pithy little sayings in the almanac. One of his favorite was that honesty is the best policy. We focus on the word honesty in that saying. Franklin didn't. He put the emphasis on the word policy. It pays well. It pays off to do well. And I would, with regard to the idea that it's subjective, I would argue that it's not subjective. There are really hard questions in physics. There are really hard questions in a lot of things. Medical, you think of medicine as being a science, it's really more of an art. You start looking at medical studies. And so there are really difficult questions in these areas as well. We shouldn't think that everything is subjective simply because there are difficult questions that we have to struggle with and have to answer. And when we talk about, in a few minutes, about starting to talk about logic, I will argue that if you can provide logically sound arguments for a proposition, ethics is not subjective. It is, in fact, ultimately objective. And maybe one of the most important objective things that we can do, because we have the ability in this day and age to really do enormous damage by the pills and the drugs and the products and services that we sell, because people are no longer able to evaluate the quality. So with regard to things like medical marijuana, let's think about that for a minute. What's one of the problems with this? So there is a lot of evidence to suggest that, for example, marijuana does really good things for cancer patients who have nausea and can't eat and are, vomiting. Right? But when they started studying this phenomenon years ago, and then it became illegal to study it because the FDA came in at the federal level and started regulating, and so all of the studies stopped. Is the pot of the 1960s and 70s or before then, when they started noticing this phenomenon, the marijuana that you get today? No, it's what? It's radically different. I mean, this has become enormously more potent. People don't just, marijuana it's a plant, it grew in nature. That's not the way, it's not just thrown out. I mean, if you do that, you're gonna go broke in this business. This is cultivated in an enormously scientific way to ensure that you have maximum levels of THC. I mean, it's a radically different plant than it was even 20 years ago in terms of the growing techniques and what the power of that drug has. And so, and it's difficult for you to evaluate that as a consumer, isn't it? I mean, this is one of the problems with the medical marijuana industry in Oklahoma is that it's just sort of the Wild West out there. The FDA has no good studies on this. And people are doing all of these hybridizations. Historically, there were sort of two strains of marijuana, and they were supposed to have different effects. Now there's still these two major strains, indica and sativa, but there's a whole lot of variance in there with regard to modern. And so we don't know what the effects will be on that. And so it becomes important that we think about what we're doing, how we're marketing things in order to ensure safety, that we're not just selling snake oil. To that end, philosophy answers three great questions that are relevant to all disciplines and all people at all places and all times. These are what I call perennial questions. The question of knowledge. In philosophical ethics, this is broken down into two subfields of ethics. The question of knowledge deals with what is it I can know and how can I know it? So the two subfields of ethics are called metaphysics that's the study of reality. How do I know if we were all Buddhists, what do Buddhists believe?
In the reincarnation.
Well, yeah, I guess until you get it right, until you realize that this is all a grand illusion. I'm you, you're me, we're the wall, and this is all an illusion. And the recognition of that this is all a grand illusion, leads to nothingness. It's one of the reasons why it's not a terribly good. Buddhism is really more of a philosophy than a religion, although it's classified as one of the 7 great religions of the world. Three of the religions of the world are monotheistic, meaning there's one God. They're all born through a monotheistic religions. We're all born of Judaism, so Judaism is the oldest. And actually, Judaism didn't start out as monotheistic. It started out as henotheistic, which means that they believed that there were other gods, but there was only one God worthy of worship. And gods, for the ancient Jews and other people of that time, had temporal limitations. Right? So is that this is the study of metaphysics. Is that real, or is this all a grand illusion, and should we all recognize that? Or is there something else? So the study of reality, metaphysics, and the study of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. What is it I can know? How can I know that? How can I know this? This turns out to be more difficult than we think. We think we know, and one of the reasons this is important for marketers is we think we know what we're saying and what we're communicating to people, and it turns out that maybe we don't know as much as we think we know. So let's start with a very simple question. What is this? Really? You sure about that?
Wood.
I don't think it's even wood. Let's, I don't know. Maybe there's some wood-like product in there. So why is this the table?
You can put stuff on it.
Because we all are.
Why isn't it a desk? You can put stuff on a desk.
No drawers.
All desks have drawers?
If you're asking the difference between a table and a desk, I'm gonna say it's gonna have drawers.
What about campaign desks? So,
That's called
Ju-
a podium.
no,
Okay.
no. Generals out in the field used to have places to put things, so they had these things called campaign desks. They folded up, they could be put in a wagon. George Washington had one, no drawers. Is that a desk? You told me that desks have to have drawers.
No, I didn't say they have to have drawers.
She said it's the
Distinguishing
difference
feature.
between.
Okay,
table
so
and a
tables
desk.
don't have drawers.
Yes.
I think also maybe like tables can have multiple chairs. Where a desk, you usually think of singular person.
Right, what about a partner's desk? I saw a partner's desk yesterday, I'm thinking about buying it. At a antique store in Oklahoma City. I'm getting a new office. I'm having to move. My office is over in Thatcher Hall. I love it over there because it's on the 3rd floor. Nobody comes. It's very lonely. Nobody comes to see me over there. I'm having to move back to the college business where people will be able to find me. That's a good thing, I guess. Bad thing, I don't know, depending on perspective. So partners desks. So desks are made for one person, partners desks. What about field desks? Field desks don't have drawers. They have little slots maybe in them. So why is this a table and not a desk? I think it's a desk because it's in a classroom, you're using it. I think of a table as being something that you use to dine on. You said that tables don't have drawers. The French always had drawers in their tables, and they were always at the head of the table where the master would sit, and you kept something, most of them had locked drawers. I have an old French farm table. It has a drawer in the end, and what was the drawer for? It was for your flatware. That's where you kept your forks and knives and spoons. Convenient. So all the French farm tables have these drawers in them. So tables don't have drawers in America. So now we're limiting it to America. So again, why is that a table? How do we know that it's a table?
It's all about perspective.
Oh, really? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that it's subjective. What about, what's that on a puppy? So,
So is this it's one thing and it's everything? Like it's a puppy and a golden retriever and a dog.
so that's a puppy. What's that? That looks nothing like that other puppy, does it?
No.
How do you know that that's a puppy? And what makes it a puppy and not a dog?
They're small.
It's the eyes.
Yeah, it's
Well, it depends on the
smallness.
age.
Yeah, it is
Depends how
determined by
old the
age.
dog is.
So when does it stop being a puppy and become a dog?
Probably say like a
Or in the
year.
words of Donald Trump, it's a canine. We had a canine that got injured. I call it a dog, it's a canine.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it, I guess. I would say like a year. Isn't that what most doctors say is whenever they go from it?
Return. Yeah.
Fully
Or
grown.
vets, I guess. Not.
What about you? When did you become an adult?
18.
The law says that it's 18. Is it?
Not really, because you can't drink or smoke now until or buy that stuff until you're 21. So
Can you not buy tobacco until you're 21 now?
yeah, they changed the law.
Really? You have to be 21 to
But
smoke?
did they change it here in Oklahoma?
They
Yeah.
did.
Right.
It's like on
But
all
Oklahoma didn't
7-Eleven
take it.
gas station, like they have.
You have to be 21 to smoke.
And think about all the people that turned like 18 and went to 19, and then they just got it all revoked again.
They got addiction.
Well, that's how they did beer in what the 70s or
Yeah.
something. It went from 18 to 21. If you were 19, you just couldn't drink it anymore.
You were just out of luck. So how do we know that that's a puppy, and that other one's a puppy, and that's a puppy? What about, let's see, what's another dog breed that everybody loves?
My mother would not consider
An
that a
Aussie.
dog.
What? Oh, your mother wouldn't consider that a
My mother would
dog.
not consider that a dog.
Well,
So
you
your
know.
mom thinks of like German shepherds as dogs.
she
Okay.
Okay, let's look at,
I wish for a pound. Big dog.
No, that's a
how do we know that that's a dog?
They look like a horse.
Yeah, I mean, does that look anything like that?
No.
How do we know? The reason I do this is because this is not as trivial when we think we are communicating effectively in advertising as marketers. We may not be communicating effectively as marketers. We think everybody has the same frame of reference that we have, and it turns out it may not be so. I think this is a desk. Why do I think it's a desk? Well, because it's in a classroom. Generally had desks in classrooms, right? It's a 3-person desk. So it's not as easy as we can think it is to know these sorts of things. So the question of knowledge becomes critically important. And one of the things that we need to think about when we are advertising, when we are selling, when we are developing products, how is it that we can know what we know? And how is it that we can communicate that to other people so that we know that they understand what we're saying to them? How is it that we know that products are safe or not safe? Or how do we know that a drug is effective? These are not easy questions to answer, and we should think about them. How is it, so when drug companies release drugs, they go through this process through the FDA. And one of my streams of research focuses, because I focus on ethics, on these drugs, whether or not they're effective. And so a colleague of mine and I who are interested in this, we start digging into the research. And it turns out that a lot of the research, like people think like, oh, there's all this rigor in medicine. Well, there's really not a lot of science. It's much easier to be scientific in marketing than it is in medicine for a variety of reasons. So for example, if we want to know what a given population thinks about a product like Coca-Cola, we can actually do very scientific random tests where we contact a completely random sample of people in the United States and ascertain what their feelings are towards Coca-Cola. You can't do that in medicine. We can't just pluck people out of the society and say, guess what, we're going to give you this drug and we're going to watch and see what happens. We're going to give you this drug. Well, it turns out that then they do other things, these drug companies, when we start digging into the research. So the math is not terribly complicated with these. A lot of these drug companies use very simple statistical analysis called ANOVA. What is an ANOVA? So most of you should have had your research courses by now, right? You should have had business statistics. How many of you had business statistics? Did they talk about ANOVA and business stat?
Not a lot.
Not a lot. God, I just wonder some days what it is that some of my colleagues touch upon, or more than touch upon. So ANOVA is used in a lot of different disciplines. What does ANOVA tell you? Well, basically, what does ANOVA stand for? It stands for Analysis of Variance. Analysis of variance. So there are measures of central tendency. What are the measures of central tendency? There's the mean, the median, the mode, and some people say range is a measure of central tendency. Some say range is a measure of dispersion. So the mean is defined as mu equals the sum of a column of numbers xi over n, right? That's the definition of the statistical mean for a set of numbers, right? So what it tells us is sigma xi, so this tells us we're going to add everything to the right. X stands for a column, the I means that we're going to look at, and we're going to go I equals 1 to the n. That means we're going to start at the first number and we're going to go to the nth number. That's a measure of central tendency. It's used a lot in statistics, so we know what the average is, and then with the average, we can then figure things like the variance, right? And so the variance is sigma squared equals, what is it? I have to do standard deviation to figure it out. E xi minus mu squared equals 1 to the m over n. All right, so this part of the standard deviation, this part of the standard deviation is called the variance, and that's what analysis of variance looks at in NOVA. And what it tells you is, so generally the way medicine works, or the way these studies work, is you put two different groups. You give one group a placebo, right? So let's say we're going to test an anti-smoking drug, an anti-smoking cessation drug. What's one of the big smoking cessation drugs that's been marketed, that's been out there? Let's see, let's watch a commercial. So we can figure out which drug this is. Chantix. And I have to turn the volume back.
Cold turkey. So Chantix can help you quit slow turkey. Along with support, Chantix is proven to help you quit. With Chantix, you can keep smoking at first and ease into quitting. Chantix reduces the urge, so when the day arrives, you'll be more ready to kiss cigarettes goodbye. When you try to quit smoking, with or without Chantix, you may have nicotine withdrawal symptoms. Stop Chantix and get help right away if you have changes in behavior or thinking, aggression, hostility, depressed mood, suicidal thoughts or actions, seizures, or worse, heart or blood vessel problems, sleepwalking, or life-threatening allergic and skin reactions. Decrease alcohol use. Use caution driving or operating machinery. Tell your doctor if you've had mental health problems. The most common side effect is nausea. Quit smoking. Slow turkey. Talk to your doctor about Chantix.
All right, so there's the Chantix commercial. Now, how is it that they know or think they know that Chantix helps you stop smoking? Well, they do very simple. So they do a study, and they give half of the people in the study, generally, historically, this is the way we do this, a placebo. And then you give another half, that's called a control group, an experimental design. And I'm really stripping this down to make it, I mean, this is a little bit more complicated than this, but you give a control group a placebo, which is a sugar pill, and then you give another group the drug. And then you monitor their reactions to see what happens. Analysis of variance, and then they report the results, right? Analysis of variance generally tells us what with regard to these two samples? Well, it's going to tell us about the variance, which is this part of the equation. So variance is squared equals mu over n squared. it's going to tell us whether there is variation among the groups and whether or not that variation is statistically significant. But guess what it doesn't tell us? It doesn't tell us which direction significance is. Necessarily. Why is that important? Well, because it could be that you take Chantix and what happens. You could have a significance between that and the sugar pill, and it may be in the wrong direction. People might smoke more, right? So it's important that we think about what it is that we're saying when we market these things. And of course, this is why you have all of the disclosures in it. May cause suicidal thoughts and depression. That sounds bad, doesn't it? May cause hypertension. That sounds really bad. What's the number one cause of death in the United States? Heart disease, heart attack. These things. So it's important that we really think about what it is that we're saying and how we can know what it is we think we know in ethics and in marketing. So 3 great questions. The question of knowledge, the question of governance. This goes to, there are, gotta turn the volume back off. The question of governance, this goes to what it is that we should be able to do. So obviously marketing occurs within the context of a legal regulatory environment. What kind of government is the best? What should we be allowed to sell? Are all governments the same? What's one of the things, if you want to market for example, your social networking site in China, what can't you have? What does Facebook do in China that's different than what Facebook does in the United States?
Don't they block a lot of stuff?
They block a vast majority of the content in China. In the United States, one of the things that we're seeing with Facebook is Facebook says we have this thing called in the United States called the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution protects 5 fundamental rights, things that our founding fathers thought were absolutely critical to a free and liberty people. What are those rights? Freedom of speech, press, religion, petition of government for redress of grievances, and assembly. Those are the 5 rights that are guaranteed by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. As Americans and in American law, we call this substantive due process. One of the categories of, or part of what we call substantive due process. These are fundamental as opposed to procedural due process to our way of thinking. China doesn't do that. They don't do this. And as a result, Facebook, if they want to go into China, and they do, they want to be in China. Why?
It's just more money.
It's a lot more money. What's the population of the United? We're going to have a census, and it's not really going to be a census. It's going to be a very large survey. We're going to call it a census. The reason it's not really a census is because is it really possible to count every single person in the United States? No, it's not. So it's a really big survey, right? So we're even getting these terms. We have this thing called a census. They're supposed to go out and count every single person in the United States. Can they do that? No, not really. You can get close. It's really a big survey. You can get close, but can you get everybody? No, why not? And this year, the census may be even worse than it was in previous years because the Trump administration has done things to ensure that some people are going to avoid being counted. It's really hard to get, for example, the homeless. Get good counts on the homeless. We try. They actually send census takers out under bridges and things like that, but it's really difficult. And then there's a lot of people that just don't want to be found. They won't answer. They won't answer the door. Because maybe they're not in the country legally. So what's the population of the United States? Well, about 370 million people. What's the population of China?
2 billion.
Yeah, it's like astronomically larger than the United States. That's a huge market, isn't it? So Facebook wants to be in that market because Facebook makes money on what? What's the value in Facebook?
Advertising.
It's really advertising, right? So there's all kinds of things that are locked down in China that you don't have in the United States because they don't have this idea of substantive due process like we do in the United States. That these are fundamental. So in the United States, this is a big question. What's going on? What's the controversy with Facebook this year? Well, Facebook is it's the Wild West, again, of advertising. And they're letting candidates like the Trump administration put out, and this is just objective. This is not me being an anti-Trumper. He has told 25,000 lies or something like that since he's been in office. That's just objective fact. And he's doing it in advertisement on Facebook. And Facebook says in the United States, hey, we've got this thing called the First Amendment, free speech. If people want to lie, they lie. You know, it's the theory of caveat emptor, which is a legal principle that says, let the buyer beware. So we got all these lies in Facebook. You can't do that in China. You also can't talk out against the communist government in China, right? So there's all these regulations that we have to think about. So the question of governance, what is the best form of governance, and how as marketers do we use that, or should we use that? Should Facebook say, look, we're not going to give you our product unless you abide by our values? China, we're just not going to do that. We're not going to do business with you unless you abide by our values. Maybe they should, I don't know. The third great question is the question of conduct. How should we behave? What's the right thing to do? Again, this is not trivial. How should I distribute things? What's the correct way of doing this? Let's take a hypothetical. Let's suppose I come to class and I have cookies. How should I give the cookies out? Let's suppose that these are really special cookies. They are life-sustaining cookies. They have everything you need in one cookie for the day.
You said you brought like a box of them?
Yeah. How should I distribute cookies?
Is there enough for everyone in here?
I don't know. Should I like, let's start there. Should I make sure that there's enough for everybody?
Well, I hope so. Bring some box of
Fair.
cookies.
Are you communists?
Now we are.
If,
Huh?
I mean, if you have the resources to make them all, then.
well, I was gonna say like life sustaining, maybe you see who needs the most life sustaining,
Yeah.
like their health or something.
Yeah. Maybe we should have 2 cookies for men and 1 cookie for women. What? That seems fair to me. Life sustaining. Men's caloric needs are greater than women, aren't they? What?
No, I was gonna say, I know some women that the caloric intake is a little bit more.
Well, I mean, there's the anomalies, right? Again, this goes back to statistics. So a lot of times we think of things, and one of the reasons that we want the mean is because a lot of statistics, particularly analysis of variance, and I'm not a very good artist, and you'll see that. This is sort of a really bad normal distribution. But we generally think of things as being, and by the way, regression analysis, which relies on ANOVA, relies on this idea of a normal. It's a series of normals, right? So by and large, on the whole, if you take the average male and the average female and you send them to the gym, who's going to burn more calories, even if they do the same workout? The male is going to burn more calories. So maybe we should divide the cookies that way, right? Give men 2 cookies. Because on average, by and large, in the aggregate, we're not talking about Serena Williams here, who has, like she's out there just doing, it's like Michael Phelps. I can't remember the last time he was in the Olympics. They were talking about what he ate and how many like McDonald's Big Macs a day he could eat. That's not average, right? I mean, that's an outlier. If we do a scatter plot, he's like way out there on the scatter plot, right? So how should we divide up these cookies? This goes to the question of conduct. Should it be based on need? Men get 2 cookies, women get 1.
I mean,
Unless,
are you trying to make money, or I feel like it just
I don't
depends on how
know.
you're trying to sell them.
that's another way we could do it, right? We could divide up the cookies based on money. I could bring the cookies in. I could have a little side business here in the classroom.
Yeah, well,
I'm a marketer, right? So I could come in with my magic cookies. And if you're willing to pay the price for the life-sustaining cookies, that's how we could decide to distribute the cookies, right? You don't have the money, you don't get the cookie.
I feel like that's realistic sometimes.
Okay.
Guess we can vote on who needs them.
That's, yeah.
We could vote on who needs them more. Okay. We could use them as a reward. Turn in really good answers on your critical thinking challenges, you get a cookie. Turn in a sucky answer, you don't get a cookie. Right? We could do it that way. So this question of conduct is one of the 3 great questions that we're going to focus on in this class. So values and ethics. Values are our beliefs about how we should act, that incline us to act. What is it that I value? What is it that you value? What makes you act? What motivates you? We can talk about values from a micro perspective, the individual, to the macro. So I have this little competition. It's probably only a competition in my mind. There's another professor in the College of Business who thinks he knows how to dress. And so forever and ever and ever, my style was bow tie, French cuff shirts, Allen Edmonds shoes. And then he started doing this. I think, probably in my own mind, in imitation of me. Now, some people say imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. I find that don't find your own style, dude. Right? Like don't speak, find your own thing. So now I have to do something different. Right? So now I've started wearing waistcoats with my suits. And I've started wearing different types of ties, not just bow ties, with my suits, so that I have a distinctive style, because I'm a marketer and I believe in differentiation. So I'm going to differentiate myself from the rest of the pack. Some of my marketing colleagues don't differentiate themselves. Like they look like an unmade bed. A lot of them. God help us all. Right? So These are the things that I value. There are also values that we can talk about from a macro perspective. Are there values that we have as a nation that we say are part of our national values in the United States?
Yes.
Sure. What the First Amendment is deeply ingrained. You go to school, you learn this, and you learn this in school about the First Amendment. You have a right, and lots of history is about a lot of the history courses that you took as a high school student, and then in your appreciation of the wider world, which we call those general education requirements. You took these history classes. A lot of it, and you have to take one of two history classes. You can then vary from that, but you at least have to take either the history of the United States to like 1870, or you have to take history of the United States post 1870. It doesn't matter which of those two courses you take. The First Amendment is going to be influential in either of those two courses. That's a value that we have as a society. This idea that we should have freedom of speech, press, religion, petition of government, and assembly. Right? That's deeply ingrained in our American value. And by the way, it's one of the things that supplants regional culture in the United States, is that people, when you ask them if they believe in these things, overwhelmingly Americans, whether or not they're hippy-dippy liberals from New York or Oklahomans, we say that we value this. Now, when you start getting into substantive examples, it starts varying greatly, right? When everybody says in the abstract we value these things, but when you start saying things, so for example, in Oklahoma forever and ever and ever, that was different than New York or California or things like that. If you said, should a grade school teacher be allowed to talk about homosexuality in the classroom? For most of my teaching career here at UCO, Oklahomans would say, no. Children, small minds, influence. What do you think the majority of Californians and New Yorkers said? Yeah, absolutely. Right. So once we start getting into specific, once we start talking about specifics, but in the abstract, we say that we have these values. Most companies also have a core set of values, but it turns out, and most of the successful companies that have been around, and there's a book called Built to Last where they detail this, have these core values. Not all of them have what we would consider good core values. Philip Morris is one of these companies that has a core, your textbook tells you this, has a deeply held set of core values. What does Philip Morris manufacture? You can Google it.
What more?
Philip Morris. Morris. They manufacture cigarettes. They're the I think the largest manufacturer of cigarettes. Or Marlboro, I think Marlboro are Philip Morris product, aren't they? Philip Morris brand.
Philip Morris is
Marlboro is.
Huh?
Marlboro is.
Marlboro's a Philip Morris brand, yeah. Philip Morris is one of the largest. The executives at Philip Morris were described as being ruthless, cunning, calculating, and saying that they saw nothing morally objectionable to selling people a product that they don't need. There's a lot of difference between selling products that we don't need and selling products that are harmful, aren't they? They insisted for years and years and years. There's a movie out there called Thank You for Smoking, and it's really based on a true story, and it follows the gun lobby and the cigarette lobby. And they insisted, they had research that there was no direct causal link between smoking and cancer. We now know pretty overwhelmingly that smoking not only causes cancer, it also causes what? Heart disease, right? It's horrible for your skin. And it's one of the worst things you can do. And there's a big difference between manufacturing. Nobody needs, in this day and age, does anybody really need a suit? We really need suits. A Lots of companies have done away with it. Even my profession, I'm a lawyer. That's what I started out as a lawyer. Even my profession, the first profession I had, has done away. Most law firms no longer require that you wear a suit and tie to work. Unless, of course, you're a litigator. And then the court rules say that you have to wear a suit and tie if you're a man. Not if you're a woman, but if you're a man, the court rules say you have to wear a coat and tie. Is that fair?
What happens if you don't?
You get thrown out of court.
What about a woman? Like, what is she?
The court rules say that a woman should dress conservatively and professionally. What the hell does that mean? I mean, I've seen women lawyers dressed in just horrible things. There was a DA in Logan County where I'm from who wore flip-flops. And I was like, Your Honor, this is not acceptable. And her thing was because they had penny blossoms on them or something, that made them dress flip-flops. Huh? What?
There are dressing. Not for the courtroom, but there's
No.
99 cents at Old Navy is different than Michael Kors.
Okay. Is that fair?
No.
No. But even lawyers have stopped wearing this kind of outfit. Does anybody need a suit anymore? A few people, lawyers, who have to go to, but do we even need suits? Should we even wear them for weddings anymore?
Technically, people don't.
People don't. Like, it's a whole thing that people are getting married and all kinds of different things. Beach weddings or theme weddings are a big deal. Get married in your board shorts. Get married underwater.
Get married in jeans.
Get married in jeans. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So there's a difference between not needing something. Nobody really needs a suit. The whole outfit is sort of ridiculous if you think about it. I mean, you've got this jacket. They make summer suits with summer jackets. In Oklahoma, you don't need a jacket at all in the summer, do you? I mean, it's just a article of clothing that causes you to get sweaty. And in the wintertime, I can tell you, this is a wool jacket. This is not warm enough. I mean, it doesn't provide much warmth. It's just custom. There's a big difference between something that we don't need, like this wool suit, and cigarettes, which are actually harmful. But the most successful companies have core values. So what are those core values? Are they good values? What is it that intertwines between ethics and values? So the text tells you that the root word for ethics comes from ethos, which means custom or customary. Is that important when we think about ethics? I think it is. Are they mutually inclusive? No, not necessarily. Are they mutually exclusive? Obviously not. But we have to think about these things. Now, a lot of business ethics texts tell you, and I don't remember if they've changed it because I've thrown such a fit. And I've written an ethics textbook, by the way, that was published by Pearson. And I didn't say this in my textbook, but a lot of business ethics texts, for example, mine was written before I was a marketer. I started out as a political scientist. And so I wrote this book with a couple of other political scientists called Managing in the Public Sector, a case book in ethics and leadership published by Pearson. And we did not say this, but business ethics texts always say the law is an acceptable moral minimum in ethics. That is a priori, absolutely 100% not true. And why is that not true? Why is that statement just wrong? Just wrong. And lots of marketing textbooks all have a section in every marketing textbook that has some section on ethics, because we're supposed to have it in every course. We're supposed to make it a part of it. So they all have in Principles of Marketing, all in Principles texts have a section on ethics. And Integrated Marketing Communication, there's a section on ethics. In sales, there's a section in the textbook that we use on ethics. And they all say things like this, and it's just wrong. And why is it wrong? It's not that the law is unimportant. So we have the law, and we have ethics. And there may be overlap here, but there are parts of the law which may themselves be amoral or beyond morality, right? So the law may be amoral or outside of the realm of morality. What are some examples of how the law can be amoral? There are two types of crimes, generally speaking, in the United States that you can be prosecuted for. These two types of crimes are called, erase some of my rantings over here. The two types of crimes that you can be published for are malum prohibitum. This is Latin, and malum in se. Malum prohibitum are laws that we don't necessarily think of as being morally important. They don't have moral import. What are things that you can be prosecuted for malum prohibitum that don't have moral import? The speed limit out here on 2nd Street is, I believe, 35 miles an hour. None of you do that. I watch you as you come into the, you're particularly for an 8 o'clock class, you're running late, careening around in the parking lot. What's the speed limit in the parking lots? 10 miles an hour. None of you do that either. And the UCO, we have a UCO police force here. We have a bigger police force than the Republic of Bolivia here at UCO, by the way. And they have nothing better to do with their pathetic lives than to give you a ticket as you come careening through the parking lot at 15 miles an hour, right? And if you get that ticket, do we say you're an evildoer? No, we don't attach any moral import to that. Why do we say that the speed limit is 10 miles an hour in the parking lot? Yeah, I mean, it's what we think is a reasonable speed to allow pedestrians to avoid you, to get the hell out of your way, because we know that you're not watching out for them because you're too busy texting or doing something else. I think I told you I rode for the first time. One of my friends has bought a Tesla. And they've got carpool karaoke in the Tesla. Seems like a bad deal, but the Tesla drives itself. Still seems like maybe a bad deal, right? So, 10 miles an hour allows the students to get out of the way of the driver. If you exceed that, we don't say you're a horrible person. Malum and se, on the other hand, are criminal laws that we generally say have moral import. That's things like thou shalt not kill. Murder at the common law was defined as the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. That we say has moral import. A lot of moral import. Thou shalt not kill. Well, unless you justify it. Right? So, some parts of the law don't have a lot of, is it immoral? Is it unethical to go 11 miles an hour in the parking lot? Do most of you even have cars that can tell you if you're going 11 versus 10? Mine actually does, because my speedometer is digital. But most cars, can you tell the difference between 10 and 11? Can you tell the difference between 10 and 12? Maybe. Between 10 and 13, yeah, a little bit more, depending on how many notches there are, right? So if you're doing 11 instead of 10, can you be held liable? Well, that's what we call a strict liability crime. Yeah, doesn't matter. The law says 10, you're going 11, you're strictly liable. And cops who are stupid will come up to the window, like Eric Cartman. Any of you seen the South Park episode where Cartman's the cop?
Yeah.
I'm a cop, and you respect my authority. And they'll ask you the dumbest question on the planet. Do you know why I stopped you? Doesn't matter. Stupid question. But because they're idiots, they don't know the difference between a malum prohibitum and a malum in se. Malum in se crimes have what we call a mens rea aspect to the crime, which means a guilty mind. Malum prohibitum generally don't. If you're going 11, Do you know if you're going 11? Probably not, but you're guilty, and you're going to get a ticket. That doesn't have a lot of moral import. With regard to contracts, in Anglo-American law, although the British have done away with this, contracts for the sale of real property have to be evidenced by a writing. Does that have any moral import? No. Why is it? That's something called the statute of frauds. Why is it that we say that has to be evidenced by a writing? Well, because we want to make sure this land stuff is really important. We want to make sure that has no moral import. So the law itself may be amoral, or worse yet, the law itself may be immoral. What's an example of an immoral law? For years and years and years. So after the Civil War in the United States, we got 3 amendments to the United States Constitution. Those amendments are the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolishes, it basically does what the Emancipation Proclamation did. The Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, freed slaves in the rebellious states. But there were these so-called border states, like Kentucky, that stayed loyal to the Union and had slaves. And so the 13th Amendment frees everybody. There's no more slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment, in order to ensure that the states treated these now free people equally, comes up with one of 2 due process clauses. The first due process clause is found in the 5th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The second is found in the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment also contains the first and only equal protection clause. So it requires that not only that the states provide due process of law for these people, but that they provide equal protection, and these are not necessarily the same things. And then the 15th Amendment gave freed men, not freed women, the right to vote. Women don't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Well, after Reconstruction ends in the South, the Southern states engage in a series of attempts to segregate the former slaves, to put them back into a state of servitude. And these laws are called Jim Crow laws, and they're passed by all the states. And it goes to the United States Supreme Court, and in a case that the Supreme Court, which was probably the most immoral case that the United States Supreme Court ever decided, in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, the court says that the Supreme Court says that separate but equal does not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution, so long as there are rough parity between the categories. So you can segregate people on the basis of race, and so long as they're roughly equal, well, you're okay. Now, the problem with this is that A, it was never roughly equal in the South. Schools for African Americans were inherently worse than schools for whites. Colleges, we have vestiges of this in Oklahoma to this day of segregation. 13 miles down the road from my hometown, I live in Guthrie, is Langston University. What is Langston University? Well, that was the state's attempt at equality. Was it ever equal? Did Langston ever have the prestige of OU or OSU? No. You couldn't get a law degree at Langston. So that's actually how the NAACP starts challenging this idea of separate but equal. They actually did it in things like higher education, where they went into Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a famous case. They went and said, you have this black university, and there's a lot of talk, by the way, in the Democrat Party about HBCUs. You'll hear this term, and maybe you don't know what that means, HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. They went in and said, you don't have a law school. So we want you to open up the University of Oklahoma Law School to African Americans. And OU said, oh, no. So they came up with an alternative law school in Oklahoma. It had no faculty. It was in the basement of the state capitol, and it had no library. Now, if you want to have a law school, you kind of have to have what? Back in that day, you kind of have to have books. They're kind of important. Not as important today as they once were, but you kind of have to have books, and you kind of have to have people to teach the classes. So they actually got students in to the University of Oklahoma. The NAACP did, long before Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas came along. So what did they do when they were admitted to OU? Well, okay, we're gonna let you come in, but you gotta sit at the back of the room. And they're gonna segregate it. They put up ropes that said colored only at the back of the room. Well, is that fair? That's the law. If you weren't white, you sit at the back of the room. What if you can't see? What if you can't hear? Sucks to be you. Sorry. The law itself may be immoral. And so saying that the law is an acceptable moral minimum is just wrong. If the law is immoral, nobody would say Martin Luther King went to jail because he broke the law. None of us would say, well, some of the Trump supporters would, that his breaking the law was immoral. Right? Most rational, normal people wouldn't say that. So the law is important, but it is not a mutually inclusive or exclusive category. It may be immoral or amoral. You don't have to follow an immoral law from an ethical standpoint. That doesn't mean that you won't be prosecuted, but you don't have to follow it. So let's talk just for a minute, and we'll continue this next time, about logic and critical thinking. So what we want is we want to have ethics that are based in logic, that provide sound reasoning for our decision making. And to that end, there are proofs. So one of the questions is, are there proofs in ethics? And the answer is yes, there are proofs in ethics, and they're based on logic. Now, there's a difference between logic and science. So I will ask you, is everything that we teach on a college campus, think about this, is everything that we teach on a college campus an art or a science? Or is there some third category? Now, what is an art? Well, generally speaking, what do we think of as art?
Graphic design.
Graphic design is an art. And what makes that an art? Why is graphic design an art?
It's creativity.
It's creative, right? So, and that's inherently what? Huh?
Art.
Art?
Subjective.
It's subjective, right? Yep, that's it. Subjective. That just got you bonus points for coming up with that answer. It's subjective. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, as the saying goes. That's actually not true. Turns out that's not true. They're now starting to do scientific experiments in philosophy departments. So forever and ever and ever, philosophy departments didn't do science. Let me back up. At the beginning or the dawn of academic institutions, philosophy was about science. And then there's this split. But to this day, we have this vestige in that if you get a degree in biology, what's the pinnacle degree that you can get biology? What's the PhD, right? Do they have a whole lot of philosophy? Well, no, because we sort of separated out philosophy. But the idea is that they're creating knowledge, right? So these three great questions. In biology, they're creating or they're discovering things that add to the body of knowledge. So they're now starting to do experiments in philosophy departments. It turns out that maybe beauty isn't in the eye of the beholder. One of the ways that they're doing this, so there's a subfield of philosophy called aesthetics, which deals with what is beautiful. And forever people said in philosophy, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Turns out it's not. Children are horribly, horribly honest, particularly babies. And so they would show babies these pictures of various people, and children will stare at a symmetrical face much longer than they'll stare at an asymmetrical face. So they'll look at, for example, one of the classic examples, Denzel Washington has almost a perfectly symmetrical face compared to Lyle Lovett. Who is Lyle Lovett married to? Anybody remember? He was married to Julia Roberts, like one of the most beautiful women on the planet, and like, I mean, just not attractive. And so it turns out that children, babies, will stare at Denzel Washington's face a lot longer than they'll stare at Lyle Lovett's face. So is beauty in the eye of the beholder? Maybe not. But we've tended to say that, and we tend to think that art is subjective. Design is subjective. Whereas science is objective. Now, those of us who study philosophy will tell those people physics. The physicists all think that they're ultimately, but there is a degree of subjectivity even in physics, because what you choose to study, what you choose to find important, if you are Sheldon Cooper, for example, what is Sheldon Cooper in Big Bang Theory? Anybody watch Big Bang Theory? Yeah, but for specifically, what kind of physicist is he? He's a theoretical physicist, right? As opposed to Leonard, who's a lower form of physicist, according to him, who's an experimental physicist. And then there's Raj, who's an astrophysicist, and their retarded friend Howard, who's an engineer, according to Sheldon. And Sheldon insists that engineers are what? The Oompa Loompas of science. That's inherently subjective. So Sheldon's fixation on theoretical physics is inherently subjective. What we choose to find important, what we choose to study is inherently subjective. So there is an element of subjectivity to it, although we are tending to become more and more, even in the fields of art and aesthetics, more and more objective. I am out of time, so we will stop there for today. We'll pick up with this next time. So finish reading a rule book for arguments for next time.